So now we're going to do together this lovely exercise to help us turn a story into an essay. How do we take a family story and make it a college level essay of exposition, expository essay? I want to let you know that the steps that we're following, that I'm asking you to follow as novice writers in a college 101 writing class, are actually the steps that I use too. The work, these 5 skills of a college class are also, turns out, skills that real writers use all the time. And I'm a real writer, and I do this too. So I think it's quite legitimate, and I want you to know that just as you write these exercises, I can write these exercises too. And in fact, I do. So here's an example of, I don't know if you can see it. Yeah, great. Here's an example of a family story that I wrote. And I've posted this online so you can see it. But I noticed that I decided to fluency write first. I used 10 minutes to think, I think this is a story I want to write. This is a story about my father in an airport trip, I think. But I didn't want to get myself all committed into 2 hours of writing or an hour of drafting without testing it. So I used fluency writing to test the idea. Is this 10 minutes isn't too much to spend on anything. It'll be over in 10 minutes. But is this idea that I think, is it really worth committing a whole nother hour or two to drafting out the story? Well, so I decided I would. And I, just as I asked you to do, I'm going to do this exercise myself. I'm going to think about who the main character is in what's a man. This is going to have to bear with me. This is about 2 or 3 pages. So this might take 4 or 5 minutes to read. But as you're listening to me read a family story out loud, I want you to think for yourself, who is the main character? And if you had to come up with words to describe this main character, what words would you choose? Okay, it's called, here we go. Get myself ready to read. Warm up a little bit, shake up my bones. All right, here we go. My dad always really saw himself as a pastor, so it was quite unexpected. It was quite an unexpected career turn in 1968 for him to be traveling to Europe for 3 weeks as part of a city planning team. After serving several decades as a Presbyterian minister, in 1968, my father left church ministry to work as a community organizer. This is how he found himself taping up a huge National Geographic map of Europe on our family's dining room wall and explaining to us how we could follow his travels, marking each one of the cities with little red stick pins. He would be gone for 2 full weeks, and in a household of 8 with 5 kids between the ages of 4 and 12, this seemed like an eternity, especially to my mom, who had to hold down the fort. I was 6 or 7 at the time, and I don't remember having ever been apart from my father before then, not even for an overnight. He went away, and then he finally came home, and my dad's homecoming was appropriately festive. He'd come home laden with treasure for all to share, a fuzzy Finnish Laplander doll and a white coat of reindeer fur, nested painted dolls from Moscow, and a 3-stringed triangular guitar-looking thing called a balalaika. I can't remember from where. And a particularly lovely, very modern designed, and appropriately extravagant Danish pin for my mother from Copenhagen. That pin became one of my mother's most prized possessions. More important to my father than any of his travel loot, though, was a whole new set of stories. My father was a preacher, after all. He spent the next several weeks at the dinner table doling out tale after tale about places he'd seen, foods he had eaten, and wonders he had witnessed. Of the many things that amazed, surprised, and confounded this small-town-raised Midwestern 30-something father of 5 were European airports. Airports anywhere, and flying in general, was still a novel and exciting thing in 1968. But in the airports in Europe, there was a perfectly Babelian hubbub of foreign languages. My father reported hearing Russian and German, Dutch, Swedish, Finnish, Danish, language none of which he had ever heard before. The announcements came through in several languages at the airport. The sounds were unintelligible, as were all the strange lettered signs. What perplexed him the most, however, were the luggage porters. Luggage porters, he explained to us, help people with their baggage and at baggage claim and at customs. And in European airports, he went on, these young men speak 4 or 5 languages or more. I did not fully appreciate this "Dad is so boring" tutorials on language and luggage and the other logistics of foreign travel until decades later when I was the one at the Luxembourg airport with an oversized duffel bag to cope with, listening to those unintelligible announcements. French, Belgian, German, and then mercifully, happily English. What I couldn't figure out for the longest time, Dad explained, is how they knew. Not only did these porters speak in an array of languages, but they always knew which one to use. They spoke French to French people, German to Germans, English to the Americans. They knew which language to use before they could possibly have heard anyone speak, and they always used the right one. My father marveled. How do you think they did it? How did they know which language to use? I don't think my father was feigning his wonder. This wasn't fake a marvel. The Helsinki International Airport was indeed a far, far cry from the 1940s and 1950s Terre Haute, Indiana, where he grew up with its church hall basements and Woolworth's 5 and dime. My parents also delighted in the dinner table conversations when they could trick us into thinking. After however long our little grade school guesses kept going, nope, that's not how they did it. Nope, that's not how they did it. He somehow triumphantly let us in on the secret. Shoes, he smiled. Those luggage porters look at people's shoes. Evidently, after surviving several airports and witnessing dozens of similarly adept luggage porters, my curious and perplexed father broke down and asked an expert, one young, accommodating, and appropriately multilingual Finn working in the Helsinki airport, explained that after a while, you can tell the nationality of people by looking at their shoes. Clothes sometimes help too, the Finnish luggage porter explained, but 99% of the time, we guess right when we look at the shoes. So that was a first draft. Now, this is an honest first draft. And as I read through, I go, oh my gosh, that's really wordy in places. And the story seems to kind of meander around. I've taught my dad's a preacher and the airports and the luggage porters. There's a lot of parts of this story. Sometimes I seem to be talking about what it was like when I was 6, and other times I seem to be talking about the airport. But those are all kinds of curvy meanders that happen in a lot of early drafts of family stories. You may, when you reread your own stories out loud, notice that there might be some warm-up time, or it might be some curvy, or you might be repetitious, or some of the sentences don't feel very good in your face when you say them out loud. Those are all signs of a good first draft. First drafts are wandery and wordy and have all kinds of things that might be sanded or polished out in later writing. But we're just gathering our thoughts, so it's really important to both read things out loud to find out how the sounds feel in your face, but it's also really important to be very forgiving, very patient with yourself. Humans wander when we set things down at the very first time. So, and guess what? I may be a more experienced writer than you. I throw in these fancy phrases like Babelian phrases, Tower of Babel, lots of languages. It's a fancy allusion to the book of Genesis. But even though I have some of these fancy words like Babel and hubbub, I still have that first draft wandery that all of you may find when you're reading your own essays aloud. So, here's the question. A story. This one's not so hard. Who's the main character? My dad, my preacher father. That's pretty clear. There's a little bit about me in there, but this is really a story of my dad. And then I want to think about, what's the part? My dad is the main character in the best part of what the best version of this story wants to be. Well, the part that's most interesting is really this part about the airport. How do the porters know what language to speak? So, with that in mind, this is a story about my dad, and this is a story about this airport. I'm going to come back, and in the next little video, we're going to work through an exercise to think about how we can use this story and turn it into an essay. See you in a couple seconds.